Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our last Zoom session for PPA 500. As you know, this will be our last Zoom session, and then our class is officially done next Tuesday with your submission of the final assessment. But this will be the last time that we are together live in a Zoom session. We have two main topics for tonight, management of human resources and the management of fiscal resources. Those two topics will then round out what we typically discuss under this heading of the functions of public administration. They will also round out all the information that we tend to cover here in PPA 500, and will also then give you all the information you then need to complete the 5 scenarios on that final assessment. And we talked about the final assessment in our last class, and I walked you through those 5 different scenarios on the final. The final assessment then is due no later than midnight next Tuesday, October the 10th. And so instead of having a live Zoom session next Tuesday, we'll just afford you the time to work on the final, and then the final assessment then has to be turned in by midnight on the 10th. So that's your final assessment that's coming due. And then you also have one final Canvas essay number 5, that is due on Sunday. That, along with the 2 responses, is normal. For that Canvas essay, what you'll be doing is drawing upon the information that we covered last week, especially the information we covered in terms of policy formulation. What you'll be doing is selecting a public policy of interest to you. So you can select any policy that you are interested in, or any policy that you have some type of working familiarity with. Or you can select a housing policy, or some type of fiscal or tax policy, foreign policy, healthcare policy. It's completely up to you and what your interests are in terms of policy areas. But select one public policy, and then choose one of the 4 decision-making models that we covered last week that best represents the way that policy was created, the way in which that policy was formulated. So you'll be selecting from those 4 decision-making models from last week: rational comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can model of decision-making. So which of those 4 models best fits the creation of the policy that you have chosen, and why you think that model best fits the policy? So that's going to be for Canvas essay number 5. Same ground rules apply to number 5 as applied to the first 4 Canvas essays. Everyone's doing a really nice job on the essays, and so just keep doing what you're doing then for Canvas essay number 5. Canvas essay number 4, I did not provide any feedback on because it was just a redo of question 4A on the midterm assessment. So you already got my feedback on the midterm assessment, so I didn't think there was any reason to duplicate that feedback. So I just provided a grade and no feedback then on Canvas essay number 4. So that's what we are looking at in terms of your remaining 2 assignments: the final assessment due next Tuesday, and then Canvas essay number 5 and your responses to 2 classmates. Before we get into what we need to cover tonight, though, I think we would be remiss if we didn't at least acknowledge what's going on in Washington, D.C. today in the House of Representatives. And if you haven't been keeping up with the news today, it's a pretty historic day in the House chamber, in that we had a motion to vacate the speakership that was filed by Representative Gates from the state of Florida to remove Kevin McCarthy from the speakership. This is the first time that a speaker has been removed through a floor vote ever in the history of the House. We've had other speakers that have resigned for a variety of reasons. Some resigned because of scandals like Jim Wright. Some resigned because of health issues. Some have died in office. So there have been a lot of reasons why speakers have not completed their entire 2-year term. This is the first time we've actually had a speaker that has been removed. And the vote today was 216 in favor of removal and 210 opposed. And we had all 210 voting Democrats all 208 voting Democrats that voted to remove Speaker McCarthy. And then 8 Republicans crossed the aisle and voted with those Democrats for the removal of the speaker. And then all 210 of the remaining Republicans all held together and voted against the removal of the speaker. You're probably wondering why it's not a total of 435 votes, but we have a couple of vacancies. We have a vacancy from Rhode Island and a vacancy from Utah. And then we had other members who were not there to vote for a variety of different reasons. They were predisposed. Nancy Pelosi was here in California, and so they were not able to vote. So you had a grand total of 426 members who voted. 216 voted for removal, 210 voted against removal. That's, again, historic because we haven't seen that happen. We have seen resolutions introduced to the floor of the House to remove a speaker, but those attempts have failed. And you have to go back to 1910 to see the last time that there was a resolution introduced to the floor of the House to remove the speaker. That was a motion that was introduced by George Norris, who is a member from the state of Nebraska. And he made that motion to remove Joe Cannon, who was the Speaker of the House in 1910, to remove him from his speakership. Joe Cannon survived that vote, but then did not survive much longer as Speaker, because what happened is by 1912, the Republicans lost control of the House and the Democrats came back into the majority. And so you then have a Democratic Speaker. And so Joe Cannon lost his speakership anyway. The problem back then is that there was an ideological conflict, if you will, between Joe Cannon, who was a Speaker of the House from the state of Illinois, and Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives in the Republican Party. Joe Cannon did not like the progressives didn't like Joe Cannon. But what was going on in the Republican Party is the number of progressives in the Republican Party was continuing to grow. And so Joe Cannon, because he didn't like the progressives, really started pushing back on this growth of progressives within the party by really taking an iron fist approach, if you will, to running the House. In that he tried to implement some very draconian rules to try and keep the progressives quiet. The problem was that Joe Cannon was out of step with the growing majority of progressives in the Republican Party. And that's the reason why George Norris then brought this resolution to remove Joe Cannon from office. Joe Cannon, after he lost the speakership when the Republicans lost control of the House, he then normally would have become the minority leader for the Republicans in the next session of Congress. He refused to be minority leader because he disagreed with progressives that much, went back to his role as a member of the Appropriations Committee, and then very soon thereafter retired and left Congress and ended up sitting on his porch, basically, back in Illinois, glaring menacingly at anyone who had the temerity to step foot on his property, and really didn't have a very auspicious end to his career in the House of Representatives. They used to refer to Joe Cannon as the old gray wolf. He was an older gentleman who had a pretty impressive gray beard and really ruled with an iron fist all the way up until he was almost removed from the speakership. So Kevin McCarthy today has been removed as Speaker of the House, and so now everything is in flux in the House of Representatives. The House cannot do any substantive work until it has a Speaker. So the way in which the rules work is that before the vote, then Speaker McCarthy put together a list of people who he would recommend to become Speaker pro tem in the event that he was removed from office. He put that into an envelope and he gave that to the clerk of the House. Whenever he was removed from office, they opened up the envelope, and the top name on that list was Representative McHenry from the state of North Carolina. So Patrick McHenry from the state of North Carolina has now become the Speaker pro tem, the temporary Speaker of the House. However, as temporary Speaker, Representative McHenry can only recess the House, adjourn the House, and run the next election for Speaker. And those are the only powers that he has as the temporary Speaker. So as we are talking right now, the Republican conference is meeting to try and decide what they're going to do, what names they're going to put forward. There is still a possibility they could put Kevin McCarthy's name forward again to be Speaker of the House. He didn't have the votes a couple hours ago, and I don't know if he'll have the votes later tonight or tomorrow. So it's likely they'll probably start looking for other people within the conference to put their names up in nomination for speaker. And then we'll go through the whole process of electing a speaker in the exact same way that we went through that process back in January through those 15 ballots when Kevin McCarthy was originally elected as speaker. So that's where we are now at the House of Representatives. We don't have permanent leadership. And again, it's kind of an unprecedented situation. So for all of us who are interested in American government and especially interested in congressional politics, this is kind of a watershed day because we've never really seen this happen in the House before. So I felt it was just necessary that we at least made mention to that. Keep an eye on it. I mean, as I'm talking here tonight, something may be going on that I don't know about. You may have breaking news at any time during this class, but keep an eye on it and see what happens in terms of the search for a new Speaker of the House. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's get back into public administration and what we have to talk about tonight. Does anyone have any questions or need any clarifications before we get into the topics that we are covering this evening? Okay. All right. Then again, for tonight, we have these two main topics, managing human resources and managing fiscal resources. So let's start with our discussion of the management of human resources. We know that managing human resources in the public sector is much different than managing human resources in the private sector. We read the Graham Allison article and we talked about this when we talked about the differences between the two sectors. We know that in the public sector, the vast majority of employees in the public sector are these career civil servants. They're career civil servants who have protection against political reprisals. They are hired based upon their qualifications, and they then retain their jobs and are evaluated based upon their performance in the job as opposed to any type of political influence. Those protections provide career civil servants with a lot of stability in terms of their future employment. However, we also then know in the private sector, the majority of employees are what we call at-will employees, in that they don't have these same types of career civil service protections. They are hired and they then serve at the pleasure of the corporation that has hired them. So it's much easier to discipline and terminate an at-will employee in the private sector than obviously it is for a career civil servant in the public sector. So in public employment, we have this idea of career civil service. However, career civil service has not always governed public employment. And there are three main eras that we have gone through in public employment in this country. The first era of public employment is oftentimes referred to as the era of gentlemen. In the era of gentlemen, from the founding of the country until the 1820s, we typically hired people based upon who they were. If you think about the national government in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, the national government was very much a fledgling government. We didn't know from one day to the next if the national government was going to continue. We had the War of 1812 when we were at war with Britain, and Britain was successful at invading the US and successful at burning the Capitol. So we had a lot of questions about the legitimacy of this new national government. So in order to make the new national government appear more legitimate to the people, we decided we needed to staff the national government with these people who came from the best educational backgrounds, the quote unquote best family backgrounds, these gentlemen who came from the upper crust, the upper strata of society. And so by staffing the national bureaucracy with these quote unquote gentlemen, we could then add legitimacy to the national government in the eyes of the public. So that's how we hired people based upon who they were through the era of gentlemen from the late 1700s through the 1820s. Now, last week when we talked about policy formulation, we said we typically get new policies or we get major changes to our current policy approaches as the result of what we refer to as a triggering event. You remember we talked about garbage can model decision making. We said we have these four different streams of thought that flow together: participants, problems, solutions, and then a triggering event. A triggering event, a choice opportunity, is something that happens that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we need to change the way in which we're dealing with an issue. The triggering event that moved us out of the era of gentlemen at the national level was what was referred to as the corrupt bargain, the election of 1824. And if you are an American history buff, you're probably very familiar with the corrupt bargain in the election of 1824. In that presidential election, we had multiple candidates who were vying for the presidency. We had John Quincy Adams, we had Andrew Jackson, we had Henry Clay, we had Crawford, we had a multitude of candidates. The top three candidates were John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay. In the election of 1824, no candidate got a majority of votes in the Electoral College. Now, from our knowledge of the Constitution, we know that in order to be elected president, you need to get a majority of votes in the Electoral College. When no candidate gets a majority of votes in the Electoral College, the election is then thrown into the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives will then select the president. When the election goes into the House of Representatives, each congressional delegation, regardless of its size, gets one vote in the selection of president. So, today, if we had an election going into the House of Representatives, California, which has the most representatives in the House, would get one vote. Rhode Island would also get one vote. And so every congressional delegation only gets one vote. And Congress, the House of Representatives then determines, based upon that vote, who then becomes president. So this election in 1824 went into the House of Representatives. We had a situation where, again, no one got a majority of the Electoral College, but Andrew Jackson had won a plurality of popular votes and also had won more electoral votes than anybody else. He just lacked the true majority, but he had more electoral votes than any other candidate. So you would think that the House of Representatives would lean toward Andrew Jackson. But what happened is John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay made a deal. Henry Clay agreed to tell his supporters in Congress to put their support behind John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams then promised to award Henry Clay with a cabinet position, specifically Secretary of State. And that's exactly what happened. And so as Clay supporters then supported John Quincy Adams, that then gave him a majority in the House of Representatives, and the House then appointed John Quincy Adams as president. After Adams took office, Henry Clay was then appointed as Secretary of State, a member of John Quincy Adams' cabinet. That's what came to be known as the corrupt bargain. That corrupt bargain was a real triggering event where people obviously were not terribly happy to see that occur because Andrew Jackson had more votes than anybody else. And so it kind of led us to this idea that we kind of have to change the way in which we are doing things. Now, 4 years later, in 1828, Andrew Jackson then had a rematch with then President, the incumbent, John Quincy Adams, and won handily and won a majority of the Electoral College votes. And so Andrew Jackson then becomes president after the election of 1828. When Andrew Jackson ascends to the White House, Andrew Jackson, he had a lot of failings. We won't get into everything that he did, and we know that he has a very negative historical representation for good reasons. But one thing that Andrew Jackson believed in is he believed that everyday average citizens could do the work of government, that we didn't need these quote unquote gentlemen. We didn't need people in government from these best educational backgrounds and quote unquote best family backgrounds, that average ordinary Americans could do the work of government. And with that attitude, that idea that everyday average Americans can do the work of government, we usher in a new era of public employment known as the era of spoils, sometimes referred to as the era of patronage. And the era of spoils, the era of patronage, now instead of hiring people based upon who they were, now we're going to hire people based upon who they knew. Did they support the winning political candidate? Did they support the winning political party? The old adage that goes with the era of spoils is to the victor go the spoils. That whenever a political party won the White House or won a political position, then that political party and that candidate could then dole out government jobs as a reward to all those folks that helped put that candidate in office. So if you helped Andrew Jackson get elected in the election of 1828, you would then be rewarded with a job in the national government. That's all well and good in terms of party loyalty. That will certainly build a lot of loyalty. It will make people very loyal to the party. It will make people very loyal to a candidate like Andrew Jackson. The obvious problem, though, is the skills that it takes in order to round up votes and to help get someone elected to political office are not the same skills that are necessary to govern effectively. And so just because you are good at campaigns doesn't mean that you are necessarily going to be good at everyday governance. And so we had a lot of people in these positions that were not qualified to do the work. So we ended up with a lot of incompetence, a lot of waste. We also ended up with a lot of corruption. And you'll remember back when we talked about ethics a couple of weeks ago, I introduced you to this person by the name of George Washington Plunkett, this person who worked in the Tammany Hall political machine in New York City. We said that George Washington Plunkett told us that not all corruption is bad. And he argued that there's honest graft and dishonest graft, honest corruption and dishonest corruption. And the example he used for us in terms of honest corruption was that example we discussed of he finds out that the city is going to buy land to build a park. So he then hurries and buys the land in advance and then sells the land to the city at a profit. He used the information that he learned as part of his public position to then help him in terms of private gain. That's what we refer to as dishonest, as honest corruption, honest graft. I think today we would agree that that is dishonest. You know, graft is graft, corruption is corruption, and using public information that you get in your public position to help you in terms of private gain, obviously that's corruption and that's something that we want to avoid. That's something that's unethical. But not just at the national level, but also in these cities with these political machines, you had a lot of this graft and corruption going on. So you had incompetence as well as corruption combining together to make for a lot of misfeasance and malfeasance in government. So as early as the 1850s, at the local level, you started to hear these rumblings from good government groups about we need to change the way in which we are hiring people to work in government. We need to start hiring people who have the qualifications and the skills in order to do the work of government. But nothing really happened at the national level until the passage of this thing called the Pendleton Act in 1883. And again, here we've got a great example of a policy change that is being fostered by a triggering event, that something happens that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we need to make a change. That triggering event happened in 1881. And that was the assassination of President Garfield. So President Garfield wins the election of 1880, becomes president in March of 1881, and then soon thereafter is assassinated by a man by the name of Charles J. Guiteau. Guiteau had written some campaign speeches for the Garfield campaign. There's no evidence that James Garfield ever read any of these speeches, let alone used any of these speeches. There's also scant evidence to say that Garfield even knew who Charles J. Guiteau was. However, Guiteau felt this is the era of spoils. I helped Garfield get elected, and so therefore I should be rewarded with a job. And the job that Guiteau wanted was ambassador to France. Obviously, he was not awarded with any job by the Garfield administration. And so in his irrational thought process, Guiteau felt that if he went out there and assassinated President Garfield's vice president was Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur was a big believer in the era of patronage. He was a big believer in the spoils system. So Guiteau felt if he assassinated Garfield, Arthur would ascend to the presidency. Arthur would obviously feel indebted to him for basically giving him the job of president. And so Arthur would then return the favor and give a job to Charles J. Guiteau. Clearly, after the assassination of Garfield, Guiteau did not get a job in the Arthur administration. The only thing that Guiteau got for his troubles was execution, and he was hanged until he died as a result of his assassination of President Garfield. But on a bigger scale, again, it was a triggering event that outraged the public and made the public think we cannot keep doing this era of spoils. We cannot keep giving these jobs based upon politics. We need to hire people based upon their qualifications. For many years in Congress, you had a member of Congress, a member by the name of Pendleton, George Pendleton, who for many years carried around with him draft legislation that would eventually become the Pendleton Act. He was never able to get that legislation through Congress until the assassination of Garfield. Then he had his window of opportunity. He introduced the legislation ended up being passed, and the legislation ended up becoming what was called the Pendleton Act in 1883. The Pendleton Act of 1883 ushers in our new era of public employment where we hire people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. We hire them based upon their qualifications. We hire them based upon their merit. So instead of hiring people based upon who they were, like we did in the era of gentlemen, or who they knew, as we did in the era of spoils, now in the era of merit, we're hiring people based upon what they know, based upon their merit, based upon their qualifications. And this is then what started the whole system of examinations, where people would then take examinations to demonstrate their knowledge and their skills, and then we get hired based upon their performance on those examinations. So the era of merit really does begin in 1883 with the signing of the Pendleton Act. Now, in the Pendleton Act, what we are doing with this era of merit is we are saying that not only are we going to hire people based upon their qualifications, but we're going to make sure that they keep their jobs based upon their performance of those jobs. We are going to insulate them from political pressures. We want to make sure that people are not getting removed from their positions because of politics. The only reason they'll get removed from their positions is because they're not doing the job well enough. So everything will be based upon their performance as opposed to being based upon politics. The problem, though, was if we are going to insulate and protect these national employees, these bureaucrats from political influence, we also need to assume that they will not be involved in politics themselves. If we're going to insulate them from politics, we're going to place some limitations upon what they can do in terms of political activity. So in 1939, we get the passage of this thing called the Hatch Act. You've probably heard of the Hatch Act before. The Hatch Act limits the political activities that bureaucrats can do in the course of their daily job. So if you are a public servant, you may not use the resources of your office in order to campaign for a candidate or a political party. You cannot use your time on the job to campaign or engage in the election of some type of a candidate or political party. So we're making sure that these public administrators are not engaging in politics with the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act was at the national level, but then after the passage of the Hatch Act in 1939, various states then started passing their own quote unquote little Hatch Acts, which impose the same political limitations upon state employees. So basically saying in the era of merit, we're going to protect you from political influence, but we're also going to require you not to engage in politics in the course of doing your job as a public servant. Fast forward then to the late 1970s. By the time we get into the late 1970s, the Pendleton Act had been around for almost 100 years. And as Congress typically does, over that 100-year period of time, Congress would pass piecemeal legislation that would add regulations onto the Pendleton Act and would make small changes to the Pendleton Act. And the accumulation of all those changes over that 100-year period of time led public servants to be very confused about what they can and cannot do. led them to be very confused about what their career civil service protections were and what they could do if they felt their career civil service protections were being violated and that they were being negatively influenced by politics. So much so that Congress and President Carter at the time decided we needed to do something, decided we needed to do something to try and sort out all this confusion in terms of merit-based hiring in the era of merit. So in 1978, we get this mammoth piece of legislation called the Civil Service Reform Act. The Civil Service Reform Act was meant to try and untangle a lot of the details that have been added by all this piecemeal legislation subsequent to the Pendleton Act, and to kind of clarify what career civil service was, and then how members of the career civil service could make sure that their civil service protections were not being violated. So what the Civil Service Reform Act did is it created several organizations that were meant to try and protect career civil service protections. One organization is what can be known as the Office of Personnel Management, or the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management. The Office of Personnel Management was designed to kind of be the central clearinghouse for all hiring that was going on throughout the federal bureaucracy. So the Office of Personnel Management would have the responsibility of reviewing vacancy openings, reviewing position announcements, creating minimum qualifications for those types of positions, developing the examinations that people would have to take in order to get those jobs. They would then administer those examinations. They would score those examinations. People who scored the highest on those examinations would then be referred back to the agency for the interview process. And typically what would happen in career civil service hiring is you would look at either the top 3 or the top 5 scores on an exam, what's known as the rule of 3, or sometimes it's the rule of 5. Either the top 3 or the top 5 scores on the exam, those names are then placed upon an eligibility list. That eligibility list would then go back to the agency. The agency would then interview those people on the eligibility list and would then make a final determination of who would then be hired for that position. So as you can see under its original design, the Office of Personnel Management really controlled most aspects of hiring into the federal bureaucracy. Now we've changed a lot of that subsequent to 1978. We are much less reliant upon examinations. The old examination that was used at the national level is what was called the PACE exam. That PACE exam has been replaced with a much more qualitative assessment of a candidate's knowledge, skills, and abilities. For most positions, especially the ones that don't have an examination, there's no longer the need for a rule of 3 or a rule of 5 from the Office of Personnel Management. And now the Office of Personnel Management is much more in a support type of role than it used to be when it was first created in 1978. But OPM was designed to try and be that centralized clearinghouse for all hiring across the national bureaucracy. Then a second organization that was created that is also still with us today is what's known as the MSPB, and that stands for the Merit System Protection Board. The Merit System Protection Board. I'll put that in text chat. The Merit System Protection Board, the MSPB, was designed for being a quasi-investigatory as well as quasi-adjudicatory type of organization, meaning that if you were a member of the career civil service and you felt that your civil service, your merit protections were being violated, that you felt that you were being demoted or you had some type of a negative job action taken against you for non-merit reasons. And so your boss is a Democrat, you're a Republican, and so they're demoting you because you are not a member of the quote unquote right political party. You could then take that case to the Merit System Protection Board. The Merit System Protection Board would then investigate your claim. If they found that your claim had credibility, they would then render a decision against the agency to have the agency restore whatever things have been taken away from you. So if you were demoted, you would then be restored to your previous position. If you were denied a promotional opportunity, you would then be eligible for that promotional opportunity again. So that's why I made it an investigatory body, because they would go out there and investigate, then they would adjudicate, and then they would place those requirements onto the agency to rectify whatever the agency had done illegally to that employee in violating their career civil service protections. Within the Merit System Protection Board, the Act then also created an office known as the Office of Special Counsel. And originally, the Office of Special Counsel was placed within the Merit System Protection Board. And the big difference between the Office of Special Counsel and the MSPB, if you felt your career civil service protections are being violated, you would take your case to the Merit System Protection Board. If, however, you were a whistleblower, and we talked a lot about whistleblowers when we discussed ethics, if you were a whistleblower and you saw career civil service protections of other people in your organization being violated, it wasn't involving you directly, but it's something that you saw going on in your organization, you would then blow the whistle to the Office of Special Counsel. Then the Office of Special Counsel would investigate your claims and would then again render a decision in a similar way that MSPB would do for individual employees. The Office of Special Counsel, which obviously is a good idea, as we talked about in ethics, we need to protect people, these whistleblowers, from reprisal, and that's exactly what the OSC was supposed to do. The problem, though, was OSC was originally created as part of the Merit Systems Protection Board, which meant the Office of Special Counsel did not have its own budget. It also did not have its own staff. So very quickly, the Office of Special Counsel had a massive backlog of cases that were being brought by whistleblowers across this immense federal bureaucracy. It became very clear the Office of Special Counsel needed to have its own resources. And so in the passage of the Whistleblowers Act in 1989, we pulled the Office of Special Counsel out of the Merit System Protection Board, made it a standalone agency with its own staff and with its own budget to try and remedy this massive backlog of cases that it had been dealing with. Then a fourth organization that was created under the Civil Service Reform Act is known as the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The Federal Labor Relations Authority was given auspices over the collective bargaining process in the public sector at the federal level. So you've probably heard of the National Labor Relations Board before. The National Labor Relations Board is for the private sector, and the Federal Labor Relations Authority is for the public sector. So the Federal Labor Relations Authority had the auspices over these negotiations between bargaining units and agencies. If, for example, the bargaining unit would argue that the agency was doing something unfair, that they were not engaging in good faith bargaining, they could then take a grievance to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. If they felt that the agency was engaging in some type of unfair labor practice, and so you have employees who want to organize and form this bargaining unit, but employees that vote to form the bargaining unit are then being denied promotions, that would be an unfair labor practice. And that would then be taken to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The Federal Labor Relations Authority had control over the collective bargaining process for the vast majority of public employees. One notable exception were the bargaining units within the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service and collective bargaining in the U.S. Postal Service is under the control of the National Labor Relations Board. It's kind of dealt with more as a private organization because it's a government corporation. But the vast majority of the national bureaucracy is under the control of the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The corollary to the Federal Labor Relations Authority here in the state of California is an organization known as CalPERB, and that stands for the California Public Employees Relations Board, CalPERB. CalPERB controls the collective bargaining process among state agencies and state employees. And again, if there's an unfair labor practice claim, that would then be a grievance that could be filed with CalPERB. So CalPERB is a corollary to the FLRA here at the state level in California. And then finally, the fifth organization created under the Civil Service Reform Act was this thing called the SES, or the Senior Executive Service. And the Senior Executive Service was an attempt to try and bridge the gap between the political appointees who are at the top of our agencies and departments that are running our agencies and departments, and the vast majority of bureaucrats who are career civil servants. When you got political appointees providing the direction for agencies, and then the work is then being done by these career civil servants, you have a gap there between the political appointees and career civil servants. So the Senior Executive Service was created to try and fill in that gap. And the way in which it was meant to fill in that gap is that we took the very top level of career civil servants, what at the time were known as general schedule 16, 17, and 18 employees, and we placed them within this Senior Executive Service. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation. When we talk about GS levels, we're talking about what's known as the general schedule. The general schedule is the position classification system at the federal level. So in that position classification system, every position in the federal government is classified at a different GS level. So there are some positions that are GS 10, some are GS 12, some are GS 8, some are GS 9, but every single position has a GS level. It's known as a grade level. The general schedule technically runs from or at that time in 1978, ran from a GS1 at the low end to a GS18 at the top end. GS 16, 17, and 18 employees were at the very top of the career civil service, just below political appointees, just below the directors and the secretaries who were nominated by the president and usually confirmed by the Senate. So what we did is we took those GS 16, 17, and 18 employees out and made them into this thing called the Senior Executive Service. So if you were at the time a GS 16, 17, or 18 employee, if you joined the Senior Executive Service, the advantages would be that you are then eligible for bonus pay. So if your organization is performing well, as making demonstrable progress toward achieving its goals and objectives, then you would then be rewarded as a member of the Senior Executive Service with additional bonus pay. Also, if you join the Senior Executive Service, you would also get a lot more flexibility in terms of moving from one organization to another. There's a lot of flexibility where you could go from the Department of Labor to the Department of Commerce or to the Department of State. And you can move much more easily across the different departments and agencies within the federal government. The disadvantage and the problem with the Senior Executive Service is that all of that bonus pay that Congress promised to Senior Executive Service members never came to fruition. Because if you think about 1979 and 1980 and 1981 and 1982, we were running deficits. And every year, those deficits were becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. So there wasn't money left over to give bonus pay to these Senior Executive Service members. But despite that, the Senior Executive Service is still alive and well today. And so the general schedule now runs from technically a GS1, even though there really aren't many GS1 positions, but technically GS1 up to GS15. Then above GS15, you have the Senior Executive Service. And those positions are then categorized as ES1 through ES5, Executive Service 1 through Executive Service 5. And then above that level, Executive Service 5, then you move into your political appointees. If you're entering the federal bureaucracy as a public administrator, coming in with a master's degree, an MPA, and maybe a year or two of experience, you're probably going to enter the general schedule somewhere around a GS11, GS12 level. And you can see GS3 and GS4, those are typically intern student jobs. GS5 to GS7 are your typical entry-level positions. GS8 to GS12 are more mid-level management types of positions. And then GS13 to GS15 are your top-level supervisory positions just below the Senior Executive Service. People who are at the GS 13, 14, and 15 level today, if they want to aspire to join in the senior executive service, there is an executive service training academy that they are required to attend and to graduate from to then make them eligible for serving in the senior executive service. But those organizations, the Office of Personnel Management, the Merit System Protection Board, the Office of Special Counsel, the Federal Labor Relations Authority, and the Senior Executive Service, fundamentally altered public employment at the national level. And all five of those organizations are still alive and well in our federal bureaucracy and kind of make up the heart of this thing known as the civil service system. Again, the major takeaway of a civil service system is that we are hiring people based upon their merit, their knowledge, skills, and abilities, and we are then retaining them, and we are then promoting them and evaluating them based upon their performance on the job, insulating them from political influence. Many members of this career civil service are also members of public employee unions. I think I mentioned in a previous class that unionization is much higher in the public sector than in the private sector. And it's about 3 times higher, in that over a third of public sector employees are members of public employee unions. Around 11 or 12% of private sector employees are members of private sector unions. So a lot more unionization in the public sector. But as you also know, in all my classes, I like to ask the question of so what? So we have more unionization. Well, so what? How does that then affect the way in which we manage personnel, the way in which we manage human resources? Well, when you have high levels of unionization, you are going to have a collective bargaining process whereby employee bargaining units and their negotiating teams will negotiate contracts with agency management. And that's the collective bargaining process. That collective bargaining process will then result in a contract, a collective bargaining agreement. And that collective bargaining agreement will then impose limitations upon managers in how they are managing their human resources. So when you have unionization, you not only have to be mindful of the career civil service protections that your employees have, but you also then have to be conversant in all of the different elements of this contract, this collective bargaining agreement. So a collective bargaining agreement will probably spell out how hiring takes place. It'll probably spell out the evaluation process, the promotion process. A lot of the conditions of work will then be spelled out in that collective bargaining agreement. So you need to know both the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement, as well as career civil service protections. So it really does impose more of a burden on managers who are managing human resources in the public sector than in the private sector. So much so that today we have really seen a migration of human resource management functions into offices of human resource management. Whereas in the past, we had line managers who were doing a lot of this HR management. We have now moved some of those responsibilities to the professional human resource managers in the HR office because there's just so many rules and regulations. We don't want our line managers to run afoul of those rules and regulations and end up with a lot of grievances to the public employee union. In collective bargaining can be a very difficult and a very protracted process. But collective bargaining looks different at the national level as compared to how it looks at the state level. And collective bargaining from one state to another state can also be much different from each other. One of the things that really governs the collective bargaining process is what we call the scope of bargaining. The scope of bargaining really refers to the types of issues that are permitted within the collective bargaining process. So at the federal level, believe it or not, compensation, what we pay federal employees, is not within the permissive scope of collective bargaining. It's not included in the permissive scope of collective bargaining because Congress establishes the compensation for public administrators, members of the federal bureaucracy. And since Congress makes that decision, you cannot override that decision through a collective bargaining process. And so what Congress has is there will be a commission on compensation That Commission on Compensation meets a couple of times a year, and then will make recommendations to Congress about potential increases in the salaries of federal employees. So compensation is not collectively bargained over for the most part at the federal level. However, if you've ever participated in collective bargaining at the state or local level, you know compensation tends to be one of the main issues that is being negotiated. So compensation at the state and local level tends to be within the permissive scope of collective bargaining. So the permissive scope of bargaining will be all those issues that are allowed to be collectively bargained over. Issues that cannot be collectively bargained over are in what we call the prohibited scope of bargaining. You cannot include those in your collective bargaining process. And back when I was in graduate school in Ohio, I did some work with local school districts and was surprised to learn that privatization as an issue is not in the permissive scope of bargaining. And so school districts and school employee unions could not collectively bargain over issues of privatization. So if a district wanted to privatize its bus services, that could not be part of the negotiations with the public employee union. Some states have a very permissive scope of bargaining, some have a much more limited scope of bargaining. We here in California have a relatively permissive scope of bargaining. Historically, Wisconsin tends to have one of the most permissive scopes of bargaining. A lot of southern states then have a much more limited scope of bargaining and will exclude a lot of issues from the collective bargaining process. Now, again, this collective bargaining process can end up being a very contentious process because you've got employee unions who are looking to maximize salaries, to minimize hours, to maximize benefits. On the other side, you have the agency management that's trying to keep a lid on costs. And so oftentimes they're at loggerheads with each other. Hopefully they won't be. And there's a process known as interest-based bargaining that has really become very popular in collective bargaining. And interest-based bargaining means that both parties come to the table sharing the same interest. And the same interest is, not just what's in the best interest of the organization, but what's in the best interest of the employees. It's kind of a human resource management type of approach to the bargaining process. But naturally, it can be a very conflictual process. And so whenever you have a conflict like that, you oftentimes will end up with an impasse where the two sides cannot come to an agreement on a new collective bargaining agreement. When that occurs, and when you have an impasse like we currently are seeing here in the Cal State system, I don't know if you're keeping up with Cal State news, but the California Faculty Association, the union for faculty, have now declared an impasse in their negotiations with the Cal State system. Whenever you have an impasse like that and you're not coming to an agreement, there are three primary tools that can be used to try and break the gridlock and to overcome an impasse. Those three tools are fact-finding, mediation, and arbitration. We'll start with the middle one first, mediation. In mediation, the two parties can agree to bring in a third party from outside to come into the collective bargaining process, to sit down at the table with the two parties and help the two parties negotiate an agreement. When I was in college, one of my political science professors was a member of the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. So he was a trained federal mediator, which meant that he went out to states all across the country and would be a mediator to sit down at the table and try and hammer out collective bargaining agreements. Here with the California Faculty Association, the Cal State system, they have gone through the mediation process. They have brought a mediator in, and that mediator was unable to come to an agreement and bring the two parties to an agreement. So since mediation failed, here they have now moved to another approach known as fact-finding, and they are currently in the fact-finding process. In fact-finding, you again bring in a trusted third party, a fact-finder from outside. That fact-finder will come in and will look at how the bargaining has been done, the proposals from both sides, will interview both sides, and will then put together a fact-finding report where they will report out, here is the state of bargaining, here's the state of negotiations. The purpose of having a fact-finding report is that by having that neutral third party look at the collective bargaining process and then provide a report on it, if that fact-finding report is very favorable to the employee union, then that will place pressure on the agency to come to a negotiated agreement and vice versa. Typically, this fact finder's report, whenever it is produced, will then be embargoed for 2 weeks, which means that only the two sides of the negotiation process get to see the fact finder report for 2 weeks. The purpose of that is to then give the parties 2 weeks to try and hammer out their differences before that fact finder report then goes public. Because once it goes public, if it makes your side look bad, it's going to make it more difficult for you to get an agreement that you want to get. So that's what's called fact finding. And the situation, the Cal State system, they're currently in a fact finding type of process. After fact finding, if you're still not able to come to a negotiated agreement, then your third approach to resolving an impasse is what's called arbitration. In an arbitration, you will bring in an external person, an arbiter, and if you really want to get an agreement where you know you have to get an agreement done, there's a type of arbitration known as final offer arbitration. And in final offer arbitration, an arbiter will come in and say, union, give me your final offer. Management, give me your final offer. The arbiter will then review those two offers and will pick one of those offers. And that offer that is chosen by the arbiter then becomes the collective bargaining agreement. In final offer arbitration, both parties are then bound to abide by the decision made by the arbiter. So if you have binding final offer arbitration, that is a way that you'll be sure that you will resolve the impasse and end up with a collective bargaining agreement. Again, the idea of unionization is that it does impose this additional layer of rules and regulations onto managers and how they manage their personnel and their human resources. And so it's a very important part of the human resource management process in the public sector. So how do we actually do human resource management? What are the functions that we will engage in actually managing our human resources? Remember, when you look at the budget of a typical public agency, you'll see that about 80 to 85% of that budget is devoted to human resources. It will be devoted to things like salaries and benefits and training programs. That's a huge chunk of the money that you're spending on an annual basis. And so since we're spending 80 to 85% of the public taxpayer money on the management of our human resources, we better do a pretty good job in this management of our personnel. So how do we actually manage our personnel? Well, the first step or the first function is obviously recruitment. We have to go out there and we have to recruit people who have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to do the jobs that they are being hired for. As we know from our discussion of Graham Allison, there are major differences between recruitment processes in the public versus the private sector. In the public sector, as we've talked about many times in this class, we have multiple values that underpin public service. It's not only all about effectiveness and efficiency, but our other values are things such as political responsiveness, things such as social equity, things such as representative bureaucracy, protection of individual rights. When we are focusing on social equity, representative bureaucracy, and the protection of individual rights, we're going to have to put more time and effort into recruitment in the public sector than if we were only focusing on efficiency and effectiveness. One of the things we oftentimes do in the recruitment process in the public sector is we engage in targeted recruiting. So we'll do targeted recruiting to try and create the most diverse applicant pool that we can possibly create. And just give you an example of how it works. The last time we went through a hiring process, when I was chair of the department, we hired a faculty member. We put together a position announcement based upon the description of the job. That position announcement, before it could be advertised, had to then be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. We also had to put together a recruitment strategy plan where we had to say, here are the sources we're going to be recruiting in, the National Federation of Black Political Scientists, the Minority and Women chapter of the American Society for Public Administration, We're going to send out recruitment letters to doctoral programs across the country that have a successful track record at graduating doctoral students from underrepresented populations. Here are all the strategies we're going to use in order to have outreach to unrepresented populations or underrepresented populations. That recruitment strategy plan then had to be approved as well by the Office of Equity and Diversity. Once that's approved and you go out there and you advertise in all these targeted sources, then whenever you get your applicant pool, you get your list of applicants that come in, that applicant pool then has to also then be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity to make sure that there is adequate diversity within that applicant pool. Then when you select your semifinalists, that semifinalist pool then has to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. Then after you conduct your telephone interviews or how you're conducting your interviews, then you put together your final list of candidates to invite on campus. That final list then also then has to be approved for diversity by the Office of Equity and Diversity. So there are a lot of steps that you go through in order to try and create these diverse applicant pools in the public sector. And in terms of timeline, we would advertise in July. We did advertise in July, and we didn't make a final appointment until the following March. And so you're looking at about 8 months there between when we advertised and we actually hired someone. That's why hiring in the public sector tends to be a very protracted and a very long process as opposed to hiring in the private sector. So recruitment certainly is much different in the public sector. Then the question becomes, how do you select employees? How do you select applicants to then interview and then eventually hire? Well, as you know, we are more in an era of merit today than perhaps an era of spoils. Admittedly, we kind of have a combination of the two in that the vast majority of employees in the public sector are based upon merit, whereas the people who are leading the organizations tend to be political appointees. So there's kind of a mixture. But the vast majority of career civil servants are hired based upon their KSAs, otherwise known as their knowledge, skills, and abilities. As we mentioned before, whereas we used to rely upon the development and administration of examinations, now we've replaced that primarily with a more qualitative review of knowledge, skills, and abilities by reviewing resumes, by reviewing educational background, by reviewing letters of reference, work products that are submitted as part of the application process. That's how we now measure knowledge, skills, and abilities much more so than through a standard examination. Clearly, the problem with examinations is that for a lot of our examinations, there was implicit cultural bias that was built into some of those examinations. Some of those examinations were just not as valid as they needed to be. There's a very famous case known as the Griggs versus Duke Power Company case that mandated that examinations, the content of an examination must match the content of the job. And that's what's known as content validity. So there's a very difficult process to go through and validate these examinations. Again, when I was in graduate school, I did some work for the Center for Public Management. And one of the things that we did is we worked with local civil service commissions to validate the examinations they were using to hire people to work in local government. So we did, content validation studies, we did criterion and predictive validation studies, construct validation studies. It was a long process to make sure that the examination reflected the content of the work. So today we've kind of moved away from those examinations at all levels, the national, state, and local. Now, certainly if you are applying for a very specific job that requires a specific skill set, there's a chance you may still have to do an examination to make sure you have those skills. So if it's some type of a coding requirement with a job, then you're probably going to have to take an examination to prove that you have those coding types of skills. Another approach that sometimes is used in selection is what's known as the assessment center. This is where an agency will put together a simulated work environment. They will then invite candidates to come to the simulated work environment and then actually do the type of work in that assessment center that they will be doing if hired for the job. It allows you to see how well they can actually do the job, the work product that they are creating in these assessment centers. But as Elton Mayo would tell us, there's always that Hawthorne effect in that people react differently when they're being watched. And so the work that they're doing in the assessment center may not really reflect the work that they will do if you hire them into the position. Once you have selected employees, you then have to allocate and evaluate the work. The way in which we evaluate and allocate the work is by engaging in things such as a job analysis, a job evaluation, and a performance evaluation. Now, in a job analysis and job evaluation, we're looking at the position itself. And we're looking at the content of the positions, the types of jobs that are being done on a daily basis, the percentage of time that's being spent on those jobs, the types of skills that are necessary in order to carry out those tasks. It's all position type of basis. In performance evaluation, it's more of a person basis where we are looking at the performance of that individual in doing their jobs. So there's position evaluation and there's performance evaluation. In terms of position evaluation, one of the first steps that we will do is what's called a job analysis. And you'll get into obviously a lot more detail with these different types of functions once you get into your PPA 577 course. But for our purposes now, a job analysis is where we will look at each individual position within our organization. And we will deconstruct each position into its component elements. So again, we will look at how much time is spent in this job supervising individuals, how many individuals are being supervised, what specific types of writing requirements are there in this position, what types of requirements are there in terms of interfacing with people outside the organization. We'll look at each discrete element of each position within our organization. But in a job analysis, we are doing it for each individual position. We're not yet comparing positions. We're saying position A, this is the analysis of position A. Position B, this is the analysis of position B. We can take the results of those job analyses and then use that information to then write our position descriptions. But job analysis is looking at each individual position in isolation. Once we've conducted that job analysis and we understand what each individual job is about, we can then move into a job evaluation. And a job evaluation is when we start comparing positions with each other for then the purpose of placing those positions into our classification system and assigning compensation. So we'll take the job analysis for a police chief and we'll then compare it to the job analysis for a patrol officer. In that type of evaluation, we'll realize that the police chief has supervisory requirements in terms of supervising the entire department. We'll have budget creation and management types of responsibilities. We'll have responsibilities dealing with city leaders. We'll have responsibilities dealing with members of the media. That's the police chief job. Those are all the positive aspects of the police chief job that will argue for more compensation for the police chief. What would argue against more compensation for the police chief would be something like threat of physical harm. The police chief is not out there on the streets, patrolling the streets on a daily basis, so therefore they are not as subject to the possibility of physical harm as the patrol officer. Patrol officers have more chance of physical harm, but they probably don't have the same supervisory responsibilities or budgeting responsibilities and so on and so on. But we'll compare that police chief job to the patrol officer job. And one of the processes we typically use in doing that is what's known as a point factor evaluation. And I've provided for you, I won't show it to you here for the sake of time, but I provided for you a link to the basic elements of a point factor job evaluation. And essentially what we will do is we will then assign point values to each of the different elements of a job. We'll weight each of those different elements of the job, multiply the point value times the weighting factor, and come up with a cumulative score for each job. So the police chief job may have a cumulative score of 95. The patrol officer job may get a cumulative score of 35. The lieutenant job may get a score of 60. And then by using those point factor scores, we can then have an empirical basis for placing those positions in our position classification system and then assigning compensation. So the police chief gets the most compensation because their job was scored in the point factor evaluation with a 95 and will get paid more than obviously than the lieutenant or the patrol officer. So again, to recap, you do a job analysis, looking at each individual job, then you compare the jobs to each other in a job evaluation for then placing those jobs into our position classification system and assigning pay grades, assigning compensation. We can also take this information that we've developed, and as I said before, we can then create job descriptions, position descriptions for every position, every job within our organization. Position descriptions are important because they clue our employees into what they are doing on a daily basis and how much time they are spending on those types of tasks. That's a traditional position description. A more modern version of a position description is this thing known as an ROD, which stands for a results-oriented description. And we've started to use a lot of these results-oriented descriptions in our agencies today. So instead of just saying, this is what the incumbent will do, and this is the amount of time they'll spend doing it, we will then add performance expectations. So for example, if you have a position of someone who is positioned at a desk in the lobby, kind of like a receptionist position, and that person has a responsibility of greeting visitors and directing them to the appropriate office where they need to go. That's a job that they do, and maybe they spend 40% of their day greeting visitors and directing them to the appropriate office. Well, what's the performance expectation? The performance expectation could be that they greet visitors and then they refer them to the correct office 100% of the time. So they always refer them to the correct office. That's what we expect this incumbent to do in terms of their performance on the job. Maybe 20% of the job is typing correspondence. In a results-oriented description, we would then go further than that and say, and here is the expectation. So the expectation is they'll type correspondence 60 words per minute and with one or fewer errors per 5 pages. That's the expectation. The nice thing about results-oriented description is that it then naturally leads into performance evaluation, because people know from their description what their performance expectations are. And if they are then not achieving those performance expectations, they are not surprised when that's pointed out to them in their performance evaluation. So it's a nice segue, if you will, between job evaluation and job analysis and performance evaluation. No one likes to do performance evaluations. Employees fear performance evaluations because of the potential for what's known as cognitive dissonance. And in cognitive dissonance, people receive information that they are not expecting. So employees think they're doing a great job and that they're performing at a very high level. But then they get their performance evaluation results and it disconfirms that. It shows them that no, you are not performing at the high level you thought you were performing at. That fear of cognitive dissonance means that they really are kind of resistant to getting these performance evaluations. I think most of us can be a little anxious about having our performance evaluated. Evaluators, managers also have some hesitation in doing performance evaluations. It's usually because of this idea of the fear of playing God, that the implications of a poor performance evaluation are very important, in that if you get a poor performance evaluation, you may then not be eligible for a promotion that you want. Well, employers, managers feel bad that they are denying people this promotion based upon the evaluation of the performance. So when employees and employers both don't like to do performance evaluation, it kind of makes it difficult for us to do a good job evaluating performance. Evaluating performance is really predicated on, number one, using the appropriate evaluation format, and number two, involving employees in the creation of the evaluation. And those are probably the two most important aspects of an effective performance evaluation system. So there are a lot of different formats that we can use for performance evaluation. I listed some of those on the screen there for you. Graphic rating, forced choice, ranking, essay, and the behaviorally anchored rating scale, otherwise known as BARS. On our Canvas site, I provide you with links to some of these. So if you haven't used them before, you can take a look at them and see how they actually work. I think we're all pretty familiar with graphic rating. Graphic rating is where you'll have categories such as excellent, good, fair, poor, those types of categories. And then the evaluator can just check one of those boxes. Obviously, that's a very easy type of evaluation to do. So sometimes employers like those because it doesn't take a whole lot of time, but there's a lot of bias that's built into them. There are a lot of errors that can occur. One error that oftentimes occurs with a graphic rating approach is what's known as the halo effect, whereby managers may want to make certain employees look angelic. And so they just get excellence all the way down the evaluation. That's a halo effect. Sometimes there's what's called a recency effect, in that employers will evaluate the most recent performance of that employee. And so that employee may be evaluated over a 6-month period of time, but the last interaction that employer had with that employee will then dictate how good or how bad that evaluation is. BARS, the behavioral anchor rating scale, is oftentimes seen as being superior to these other formats. And that's because it really does identify the types of behaviors that will lead to certain types of evaluations. So it's very similar to a grading rubric that we might use in a syllabus. So the grading rubric will say, if you exhibit this behavior, you will get an A. If you exhibit this behavior, you'll get a B. If you exhibit this behavior, you'll get a C. So if you get a B, you know why you got the B is because you exhibit this behavior. If you want to get an A next time, here's what you'll need to do in order to get that A. The nice thing about a behavioral anchored rating scale is it provides formative feedback back to the employee so that the employee knows how to improve their performance in the future. But again, it's not all about the format. It's also about involving your employees in the creation of the performance evaluation. The more people are involved in the creation of performance evaluations, the more likely they are to trust the outcome of those evaluations. If they were involved in putting it together, putting the process together, they'd be much more likely to then trust the results of that process. Performance evaluation then is used to identify performance problems, poor performance that can then be mitigated through the offer of training and development. So if you identify poor performance, you then offer training and development opportunities to try and rectify that skill set so that the performance will improve in the future. So closely tied to performance evaluation is the idea of training and development. Also closely tied to evaluation then is the fourth function, which is discipline and sanctioning. There is a misunderstanding, I think, among many members of the public that career civil servants cannot be terminated, that they cannot lose their job. And that is not true. Career civil service means that any negative job action must be based upon documented poor performance. And you have to have documented examples of poor performance over a period of time before you're able to discipline, sanction, and perhaps even terminate a career civil servant. So you'll provide a performance evaluation, you'll identify deficiencies in that performance. You will then offer training and development opportunities to rectify those deficiencies. Then maybe 3 or 6 months later, you will then evaluate performance again. If there are still deficiencies in performance, you then offer more training and development opportunities. Then later on, you will evaluate the performance again. And after you have done this multiple times and documented multiple subpar performance evaluations and multiple offers of training and development, only at that time, after you have that written documentation, can you then move into discipline, sanctioning, and termination. But the important thing about working with career civil servants is, again, everything needs to be written, everything needs to be documented, very much like what Max Weber told us way back in his ideal bureaucracy. Written documentation must guide these discipline and sanctioning types of decisions. But those are the basic functions that you will learn about in your 577 course. You'll get into more specifics, hopefully, in terms of different types of job analysis, different types of job evaluations in addition to point factor evaluations. And you really start to, as I say, put some flesh on the bones in terms of some of the details in how you can more effectively lead and manage employees within your organization. But at least at this point, what we've done is we've kind of sketched out the major parts of human resource management. And managing human resources is obviously a major function that we do as public administrators. I've been talking a lot, so let's take a little bit of a break and ask, do you have any questions or need any clarifications on any of the information that we've covered up to this point in time? I think, again, for the final assessment, the information you really need to be able to convey the different eras of public employment, the era of gentlemen, the era of spoils, the era of merit, and kind of draw a conclusion to what era we are currently in, and an understanding of why hiring in the public sector takes so much longer than hiring in the private sector. And then just a general overview understanding of these different functions of human resource management: recruitment, selection and allocation, evaluation, and then sanctioning and discipline. So any questions about any of those topics that are covered on the final assessment? Okay. Very good. All right. Since we are all crystal clear on that, let's go ahead and take our evening break as we normally do. So let's take our break. My clock says it's 5:22. Let's just say let's take a break until 5:35, and we'll come back at 5:35. And when we come back at 5:35, we will talk then about managing fiscal resources, and that will then wrap up all the information that we cover in this course. So come back at 5:35, and we will do essentially budgeting and finance. Okay, welcome back. We are recording again, and this is our last leg of our class here, our last hour or so, covering our last topic, which is the management of financial resources. Before I get into that, though, I was just checking out the news, and the latest news that I know we started this class talking about the ouster of the speaker as a historic move. The last piece of news I just heard is that Kevin McCarthy has said he is not going to run again for speaker. He would be eligible to run again if he wanted to, but he is not going to do that. And so the House is still without a speaker as we speak. No pun intended. Okay, let's get into our last topic, which is the management of financial resources. And again, harken back to when we talked about accountability and ethics. We said one of the major differences between public and private sectors. In the public sector, we are dealing with the public money. We're dealing with public taxpayer money, which means that we as administrators are in this fiduciary role where we are attempting to manage public taxpayer money that obviously does not belong to us, but we're trying to manage it as efficiently and effectively as possible in that fiduciary type of relationship. So when we match financial resources in the public sector, obviously we do it primarily within the parameters what we refer to as budgets. Now, we're all probably very familiar with what a budget is. A budget is basically a prospective document where we are saying, this is how much money we plan to spend next fiscal year, and this is what we plan to spend that money on. That is a basic definition of a budget. Again, it's very prospective because it's looking at what we're spending money on or plan to spend money on in the next fiscal year. However, as I always tell my budgeting classes whenever I teach budgeting, I think the definition of a budget is really deeper than that and really goes beyond just a statement of dollars and cents, in that a budget really is a statement of societal priorities. If you want to know what a society prioritizes, you can take a look at its budget. Budgets are all about meeting infinite demands with finite, limited resources. And whenever you have infinite demands and you have finite resources, it means you're going to have to make decisions. It means you're going to have to choose which programs and which organizations get funded, which programs and which organizations do not get funded. You have to make decisions about which organizations get an increase in their funding, which organizations do not get an increase in their funding, or even can get a cut in their funding levels. So really, it's all about decision making, and it's a microcosm of the priorities of a society. The priorities will then be incorporated within the budget. Those things that are not priorities obviously will then not make it into that society's budget. So I think when we look at budgets on a deeper level as being a statement of societal priorities, I think that we really do elevate the meaning of a budget and the significance and importance of budget documents. Now, in the public sector, we typically deal with two main types of budgets. We have operating budgets and capital budgets, and that's true at the state and local level, not as true at the federal level. But the same local level, these two different types of budgets, operating versus capital. Typically, an operating budget will encompass the money that we are spending to keep the organization operating. So the day-to-day expenditures of the organization will then be included within this operating budget. So things such as salaries and benefits and supplies and utility costs, all those things are considered to be operating expenditures. Then we also, at the state and local level, have separate capital budgets. And those separate capital budgets are then reserved for spending on capital projects. And so if you want to build a new city hall, or build a new recreation center, or buy a new fleet of police vehicles, those are very high price tag, long lifespan, non-recurring types of expenditures. And since they are so costly, and since they don't recur every year, and since they are going to be with us for many, many years, we want to be a little bit more rational in how we make those decisions. And so those more rational decisions then get made in a capital budget. So operating budgets are for the day-to-day expenditures of the organization. Capital budgets are for those long-term capital projects and the funding of those long-term capital projects. Now, that is very true at the state and the local level. The federal level is a little bit different in that the federal level does not necessarily maintain a separate capital budget. The federal level basically has a unified budget where everything goes into the budget, regardless of it's for funding day-to-day projects or if it's for capital projects. It's all going into that unified budget. One of the reasons why the national government doesn't use separate capital budgets is because it doesn't have to. The size and scope of the federal budget is so large that even a $100 million capital project is going to be a drop in the bucket for the federal government. For a local government, a $100 million new building, if you put that in the operating budget, it would be cataclysmic. It would mean that that local government could never balance its budget. It would never be able to come up with enough revenues to balance $100 million in extra expenditures. So that project then gets segregated out into a separate capital budget. This is, again, a good example of mixed scanning decision-making that we had talked about last week. Small, mundane issues such as what we spend on supplies and what we spend on utilities, those small issues can be done more incrementally in an operating budget. Decisions about $100 million buildings, those are much bigger decisions. We want to be more rational with those decisions. And so they are done in a separate capital budgeting process in separate capital improvement plans. So how do we put budgets together? How we put budgets together at the state and local level kind of follow the same process that we typically see at the national level, with some notable exceptions. And I'll point out some of those exceptions to you as we move through this discussion. But in the process of putting together a budget, there are essentially 4 different phases to the budgeting process. There's preparation, formulation, execution, and evaluation. And so let's talk about the federal level and use the federal level kind of as our guide for understanding these 4 different phases in the typical budget process. So your first phase is the preparation phase. In the preparation phase, we have to know how much revenue we're going to generate before we can know how much money we have to spend. So the preparation phase, we will engage in things such as revenue forecasting. We'll forecast the amount of revenue that we think we're going to generate in the next fiscal year. And then we'll also estimate our expenditures. And so we'll ask questions such as, in the next fiscal year, if we want to maintain the same service level that we delivered last year, how much more is that going to cost us in the next fiscal year as compared to what it cost us last year? So we do revenue forecasts and we do expenditure estimates. Two of the main organizations that are involved in budget preparation are the Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office. The Office of Management and Budget is the central budgetary arm of the president. So it serves the White House and the executive branch. As we put the president's budget together, it's OMB that is required to go out there and solicit budget requests from all the different agencies, to review those budget requests, to then typically make reductions to those requests, and then pull everything together into the president's executive level budget. CBO is the Congressional Budget Office, and it's kind of the counterweight from Congress's perspective. So Congress created the Congressional Budget Office to provide them with the expertise that the OMB provides to the president. And so you've got two competing organizations, the OMB on the executive side, the Congressional Budget Office on the legislative side, and both of those organizations will be putting together revenue forecasts and expenditure estimates to get us ready for the creation of the presidential budget. The preparation phase of the budget cycle at the national level can run for an entire year before the president's budget is ever created. But once the president's budget is created and transmitted to Congress, we then move from what's called the preparation phase into the formulation phase. So in the second formulation phase, this is where Congress receives the president's budget, reviews the president's budget, and then makes changes to the president's budget that it sees necessary. At the federal level, the fiscal year runs from October 1st until September 30th. So in preparation for the next fiscal year that's going to begin in the following October 1st, formulation will probably begin sometime in early February when the president delivers their budget to the Congress. In formulation, when the president's budget gets delivered to Congress, the starting point in formulation is the budget committees in the House and the Senate. So the House and the Senate each have a budget committee. These budget committees are charged with the responsibility of approving what are called a concurrent resolution on the budget. I'll put that in our text chat if I can spell it and talk at the same time. A concurrent resolution on the budget. This concurrent resolution on the budget will establish the maximum allowable amounts of spending, what are known as the top line numbers for all of our different appropriation areas, all of our different spending areas. So the concurrent resolution on the budget will say, here is the maximum amount of money we can spend on defense programs. Here's the maximum amount we can spend in the Department of State for international programs, and so on and so on. This concurrent resolution on the budget is something that in this year was negotiated in April and May between the leaders of the House and the Senate and actually the White House. And they kind of came to an agreement on what those top line numbers would be for all of the later appropriation bills. And they came to that agreement. It's supposed to be done by April 15th. They kind of came to the agreement a little bit late this year. I think it was the second week of May or so that they came up with this concurrent resolution on the budget. But once we get this agreement on the maximum amount of money that we are going to spend across all of our expenditure areas, then the budget goes to our appropriations committees. And there's one appropriations committee in the House, and there's one appropriations committee in the Senate. Each of those appropriations committees will have 12 separate subcommittees. Each of those subcommittees will focus on a different area of spending. So you'll have a defense appropriations subcommittee. You'll have a Veterans Affairs and Military Construction appropriations subcommittee. And you'll have 12 subcommittees, each dealing with their own area of appropriations. Those subcommittees will then create these appropriation bills that hopefully will be in alignment with the concurrent resolution on the budget. will then hold hearings and make amendments to those appropriation bills. And then each subcommittee is then supposed to pass their appropriation bill back up to the parent appropriation committee. The appropriation committee then, when it receives these appropriation bills from the subcommittees, will then hold their own hearings, will then do their own markup, make their own amendments and debate these bills. And then the appropriation committees will then pass the bills out to then be discussed on the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate. In the House of Representatives, we have an additional layer that's known as the Rules Committee. So when these appropriation bills come out of the Appropriations Committee, they then have to go through the Rules Committee, and the House Rules Committee will then pass a rule that will govern when and how the debate on this legislation will occur on the floor of the House. Now, let's pause our discussion just very briefly at this point in time to recognize that there are different types of spending that go on in the federal budget process. And this is very germane to actually what we see playing out on the floor of the House today in that successful motion to vacate the speakership. There are two main categories of spending. There's what's called discretionary spending and what's called mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has direct control over. So if there is a social services program and Congress decides we want to cut spending on that program by 20%. If it's a discretionary program, they can do that directly. They can do that. If they want to cut 20%, they can cut 20% because it's discretionary in nature. All of that discretionary spending goes through this process known as the appropriations process. In the Constitution, we have an appropriations clause that says that before Congress can remove money from the Treasury, Congress must first appropriate those funds. An appropriation basically just means saying how that money is going to be spent. That's what appropriations are all about, saying this is how we are going to spend the money. So for discretionary spending, the way the process is supposed to work is that the appropriations committees in the House and the Senate are supposed to pass 12 separate appropriation bills that will then go to the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate. Those 12 appropriation bills will then be debated and will then be passed by the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate. Typically, those appropriation bills, when they come out of the House, will look different than what they will look like when they come out of the Senate. So you then have to have a conference committee where members of the House and members of the Senate sit down and hammer out the differences in these appropriation bills. Once the conference committees come up with a uniform version of an appropriation bill, it then goes back for passage in the House and back to passage in the Senate. Once it passes the House and the Senate in identical version, it is then ready to go to the president for the president's signature, hopefully by September 30th, before that new fiscal year then begins on October 1st. That's the process by which discretionary spending is supposed to occur. Then you have a second category of federal spending that's known as mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is spending that Congress does not have direct control over. So spending on things such as interest on the national debt. Congress borrows the money. Congress has to then legally repay that money in principal and interest payments. Congress can't change those principal and interest payments unless they refinance the debt. So that's mandatory in nature. You think about spending on things such as entitlement programs. Entitlement programs are eligibility-based programs, whereby if people meet the eligibility requirements, they are then legally entitled to those benefits. If you want to spend less money on, say, Social Security as an entitlement program, in order to spend less on Social Security, you cannot do that directly through appropriations. You would have to go through an authorization process whereby you would change the eligibility requirements. And so, well, we're going to raise the retirement age to 72 years old. By raising the retirement age to 72, you then have less people who are eligible to collect those benefits, and therefore you will then spend less on Social Security. It's more of an indirect way you have to go through in order to reduce spending. So that's what's known as mandatory spending. Mandatory spending goes through an authorization process and goes through authorization committees. Discretionary spending goes through an appropriation process and goes through appropriations committees. Now, why is that important for what happened on the floor of the House today? One of the criticisms that Representative Gates and the other 7 people, Republicans who voted against keeping Kevin McCarthy, was that McCarthy had promised that they would return to what's called normal order or regular order, which means that McCarthy had promised that they would go back to this process of passing 12 separate appropriation bills. For the past 27 years, Congress has not done that. Congress has been unable to pass 12 appropriation bills by the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. And again, this year, we saw an example of Congress being unable to pass all 12 appropriation bills by the end of the fiscal year on September 30th, which was this past Saturday. If you're watching any of that, you saw that this past Saturday, there were still 8 appropriation bills that had not been agreed to by the House of Representatives. So when the House and the Senate have not approved all 12 appropriation bills, then they pass what are called continuing resolutions or CRs. And you probably saw that this past weekend if you were watching. A CR, a continuing resolution, was passed that would temporarily fund all these appropriation bills that had not yet been passed. All those different spending areas would then be temporarily funded at a reduced amount to what they got last year for a period of 45 days. That 45-day continuing resolution buys Congress time to work on those appropriation bills. And then hopefully by the end of those 45 days, Congress would then have agreement on those appropriation bills that could then be passed and then signed by the president. So we are currently operating under a continuing resolution, just as we have over the past 27 years. That's not the way the process is supposed to work. So that's why some Republicans, a small handful of Republicans, were so upset with Kevin McCarthy. He had promised that we would pass 12 appropriation bills, and the House did not do that. The House passed a continuing resolution, just like they've passed in previous years. Those continuing resolutions will keep the government operating for those 45 days. Once those 45 days end, if Congress has still not come to agreement on those outstanding appropriation bills, chances are, as they've done in the past, they'll pass another continuing resolution, maybe for another 30 or 45 days. Eventually, Congress and the president will get tired of continuing resolutions. And so once we get into December, turning into January, we're well into the fiscal year. Somebody's going to get tired of passing continuing resolutions. And when that happens, you then have 2 options. One option is a partial government shutdown, as we have seen a couple times in the past few years, or the passage of what's called an OBRA. And an OBRA stands for an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. And in an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, what Congress will do is they'll take all those appropriation bills that have not yet been passed and will dump them all together into a mammoth piece of legislation known as an OBRA that's often thousands of pages long, and will then pass that late at night to fund the government. The problem with the OBRA is that it's so massive. There are so many spending items in the OBRA that people who vote for the OBRA don't even know what's in it. And we don't really know all the details of the OBRA sometimes until a week or 2 after that OBRA has been passed. So the people who wanted to remove or did remove Kevin McCarthy today, those Republicans, they were upset because yet again this year we are using a continuing resolution and we are moving down the road, as we've always done in previous years, toward the use of an OBRA or maybe even a government shutdown. And they have been promised the passage of 12 appropriation bills into what they call regular order. So that's why it's very germane for what happened today. But in a perfect world, which again has not happened in almost 3 decades, but just humor me for a second. In a perfect world, the way the process is supposed to work, all 12 of these appropriation bills are then on the president's desk no later than September 30th. The president signs these appropriation bills. Then the new fiscal year begins on October 1st. When that new fiscal year begins, we then shift from formulation into execution. Budget execution is when we actually go out there and spend the money in the legally appropriated manner that the law requires. So from October 1st until September 30th, throughout that fiscal year, we are spending the money, we're implementing the budget. That's the budget execution phase. Then at the end of the fiscal year, the following September 30th, when that fiscal year expires, we then move into the fourth phase, which is the evaluation phase. And this is where we go back and we audit the books. We go back and we look at how we spent the money. We'll ask the question, not only how do we spend it, but oftentimes we'll ask, how well did we spend the money? How did spending this money help us accomplish our stated goals and objectives? As you'll learn in your budgeting course, there are different types of audits that get done in evaluation. One type of audit is what's known as a financial or legal audit. In a financial or legal audit, we ask the question, how did we spend the money? Did we spend the money in the legally appropriated manner that we were supposed to spend the money? Another type of audit is a performance or management-based audit. With those, we ask the question, how well did we spend the money? How well did the spending of this money help us accomplish our outcomes and our goals and our objectives? So in a very large nutshell, that is how the federal budgeting process is supposed to work. Now, here in the state of California, our process works somewhat different than how the federal budget process does. Here in California, we have a different fiscal year than at the federal level. The federal level, the fiscal year runs from October 1st until September 30th. Here in the state of California, our fiscal year runs from July 1st until June 30th. So a completely different fiscal calendar. The way our process works is that instead of having an Office of Management and Budget, here in California, we have a Department of Finance. And the Department of Finance works with the governor to put the governor's budget together to get it ready to submit to the state legislature. Instead of a congressional budget office, here in the state of California, we have the Legislative Analyst Office, or the LAO. And the LAO then provides a lot of the analysis in terms of revenue projections and expenditure estimates. Whenever there are issues that are placed on the ballot, LAO will also then do what we call score those issues. The scoring of an issue is when LAO will say, this is how much we can anticipate that if this issue is passed by voters, this is how much it will cost the state of California. So the LAO is kind of the corollary to the CBO, but it's here in California. The governor, in connection with the Department of Finance and sometimes also informed by some of the work of the LAO, will put the budget together in January. That budget then gets transmitted to the state legislature for its consideration. One of the big dates in the budget process here in the state of California is what's known as the May revise. And around the middle of May, we will then have a May revise that will offer revisions to the assumptions that the governor's budget was based upon back in January. So when the governor puts their budget together, they put it together based upon assumptions. So assumptions in terms of here's the amount of revenue that we anticipate we will generate. And so therefore, this is the amount of money we have to spend. Between January and May, things can certainly change. And so the Legislative Analyst Office and Department of Finance will look at how revenue has flowed in between January and May. If we're actually generating more revenue than what we thought we were going to generate in January, it means that there's more money available to spend, and the governor will then make revisions to their budget based upon this May revise. If, however, the May revise shows that revenues are trailing behind what we thought they would be, we're not generating as much revenue as we thought, then that May revise will then lead to a reduction in the amount of spending that can be done. If you remember last year, the federal government, as well as the state of California, moved the tax payment deadline from April 15th, I believe it was, until October 15th. What that did is it delayed the influx of state income tax revenue. So in that May revise, you had less money coming in than what you thought you were going to have because of the change in the tax filing deadline. And so you had to then reduce some of the spending in that May revise. The real work in the state legislature is going to happen after that May revise is received in the middle of May. Then they really know what's in the governor's budget. They really know how much money there is to spend. And then throughout the rest of May and the month of June, the first 2 weeks of June, the state legislature then considers the governor's budget based upon those May revisions. By June 15th, the state legislature is supposed to then pass the budget bill. We don't have 12 separate appropriation bills like at the federal level. We have one unified budget bill that gets passed by June 15th. Then it's supposed to be signed by the governor no later than June 30th for the beginning of the new state fiscal year on July 1st. Here in California, we have a much better track record of getting budgets done by the beginning of the new fiscal year than what we've seen at the federal level. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One reason for that is one party dominance, is that here in the state of California, 62 out of 80 seats in the California Assembly are Democratic seats. And so that is more than the 2/3 majority, more than a supermajority. It's really about 3/4 majority. You look over in the California Senate, out of the 40 seats in the California Senate, 32 of those are democratically held seats. There are only 8 Republican held seats in the entire 40-member California Senate. So there you've got an 80% supermajority for Democrats. Combine that with a Democratic governor and one-party control makes it relatively easy to pass a budget, much easier than the divided control that we see in Washington, D.C. Another reason why it's easier here in California to pass a budget is we revised Proposition 13 a few years ago so that you can pass a budget through the state legislature now with a simple majority. You no longer need a 2/3 majority to pass the budget. Now, Democrats have the 2/3 majority, but they don't need it. You only need a simple majority. Now, if you want to increase taxes, then you need to get a 2/3 vote to increase taxes. But to just pass the budget, you only need a simple majority. So it's made it much easier for California to get its budget done on time. But even though the budget is done on time and is signed into law by July 1st, the beginning of the new fiscal year, there's still work to be done. And here in California, we have a process known as trailer bills. And with these trailer bills, what will happen is throughout July and August, the state legislature will pass bills that will govern the implementation of the budget. They will provide the specifics to state and local agencies in terms of how this money is to be spent, the eligibility requirements for beneficiaries to receive these funds. And oftentimes local governments have to wait for these trailer bills to be passed before they know legally how they are supposed to spend the money that's incorporated within the state budget. Now, when I was a school board member, we oftentimes would have to wait until sometimes August before we would get the trailer bill that would tell us exactly how we were allowed to spend the funds that we got from the state for our students in our school district. So that trailer bill approach is a little bit different than what we see at the national level. But regardless of whether you're looking at budgeting at the national, state, or local level, you follow these 4 basic types of phases: preparation, formulation, execution, and evaluation. And you'll get into some more specifics in terms of how all these 4 phases work once you get into your 555 course. But what do budgets look like? Some of you may have dealt with public budgets before. Some of you may have never have dealt with or seen a public budget. But public budgets can look different depending upon the budget format that is being used. Here in this course, we introduce 4 main types of budget formats that you're most likely to see here in the US in public budgeting. And then you'll get into the specifics of how all these different budget formats work once you get to your 555 course. However, if you want to get a little bit of a foreshadowing into what these different budget formats look like, on our Canvas site, I have provided links to examples of line item, performance, program, and zero-based budgets. We're not going to go through them here in class tonight because for the sake of time, but if you want to take a look at some examples, I have those linked on our Canvas site. And then, as I said, you'll get those examples again once you get into your public budgeting course. But for our purposes tonight, we're going to just talk about what these budget formats are and some of their advantages and their disadvantages and what types of governments tend to use them. There is a famous budgeting scholar by the name of Alan Schick. I'll put his name in text chat for you. Alan Schick. And Alan Schick argues that there are three main purposes that governments can use their budgets for. One purpose that a budget can be used for, according to Schick, is control, to allow the government to control how much money is being spent and what that money is being spent on. The second purpose for a budget is to use it as a management tool to help you better manage and more effectively manage the operations of your organization. And then, according to Schick, the third purpose of a budget is for planning. We can use our budget as a planning tool to help us plan all the operations of our organization. So control, management, and planning are the three purposes of a budget document. The first budget format that you see used most commonly here in the US, especially at the local level, is what's known as the line item budget. In a line item budget, also sometimes known as an object of expenditure budget, and that's the same term for the same type of budget, line item or object of expenditure, we organize the budget according to line items, according to objects of expenditure. So we'll have one line item for salaries and then the amount that's being spent on salaries. We'll have a line item for benefits and then the amount of money being spent on benefits. We'll have a line item for supplies and the amount of money being spent on supplies. That's a very simple line item type of budget. That type of simple line item budget is used for the purpose of control because we can see exactly how much money is being spent on all these different areas of expenditure. So if you want to control what you're spending and how much you're spending and what you're spending it on, a line item budget probably makes a whole lot of sense. Just about every government has some element of a line item in their budget approach. Almost everyone uses a line item budget. It's a very simple, a very easy, and a very quick way of putting your budget together. The disadvantage of a line item budget is it doesn't give you a lot of information. It doesn't provide you with any information whatsoever about how efficiently and how effectively you are spending your money. It only says, here's what you spent, here's what you're spending, and here's what you're spending it on. These line item budgets are usually based upon the line item budget from last year. So this is what we spent last year. This is what we spent it on. So we're going to increase it by maybe 3 or 4% to keep up with inflation. And that then becomes the budget for this next fiscal year. Line item budgets that are oriented around control really emphasize the decision-making model of obviously incrementalism. Very incremental, marginal changes in what we are spending from one year to the next. However, they're not going to give us the information we need to understand how well we are spending our money. So that provides us then with the opportunity for a second type of budget format, which is known as a performance-based budget. Performance-based budgets are used to emphasize the management function of budgets. So it goes beyond control and it emphasizes management. In a performance-based budget, we will incorporate into our budget performance expectations. So here's X amount of money that's being spent on 10,000 hours of police patrols. Great, we're spending this amount of money to fund 10,000 hours of police patrols. Well, so what? What does that give us? What are some of the performance indicators of how well we are doing those police patrols? Well, a performance indicator may be a reduction in violent crime rates of 20% between this year and next year. That's a performance expectation. That's a performance indicator that we will then incorporate within our budget document. That then gives us the empirical information that we need to truly assess how well we are doing our job, how well we are spending our money. That's what's known as a performance-based budget. Performance-based budgets started in like the 1950s, early 1960s, what's known as the classical approach to performance-based budgeting. They kind of went out of favor for a while and then made a big renaissance and big return in the 1990s. The new approach of performance-based budgeting really does look at outcomes, looking at, well, what are the consequences of spending X amount of money on 10,000 hours of police patrols? Some local governments are now using performance-based budgets, but when they do, they oftentimes combine line item and performance-based. So the first part of the budget will be line item, then the second part of the budget will have those performance indicators embodied within it. But that's to emphasize your budget document for the purpose of helping you manage your organization. The third type of budget format, again, I have these all linked on our Canvas site, but the third type of budget format is what's known as a program-based budget. Program-based budgets are a completely different type of animal in that with a line item or a performance-based budget, the budget is organized around units, divisions, and departments. So you would have a police department in its budget. You would have a fire department budget, and so on and so on. In a program-based budget, rather than budgeting according to department, we budget according to the program and the program objectives. So, for instance, you may have a program such as protection of persons and property. That's your program. And your goal may be to, reduce crime rates by 20%. Every activity that is done in that city, whether it's done by the police department or by the fire department, any activity that contributes to the protection of persons and property will be budgeted together under that program of protection of persons and property. So you kind of remove those departmental divisions between police activities and fire activities. You budget everything together under the program that those functions are meant to try and achieve. So fire and police activities would all be budgeted together under the program protection of persons and property. By doing so, that then allows you to see how all the different activities in your organization then contribute to the achievement of your goals. That is then using your budget as a planning tool to see how all the different elements of your organization are working together to achieve your organizational goals. Program-based budgets are relatively rare at the local level. We tend to see more program-based budgets used at the state level and at the federal level. And the Department of Defense, since the 1960s, has used a program-based type of budget. Then your fourth type of budget is what's called a zero-based budget. A zero-based budget is a very bottom-up way of putting your budget together. You will then look at the lowest level in your organization where budget decisions can be made. Those are then referred to as decision units. Each of those decision units, you may have dozens of them, will put together what are called decision packages. Each decision package will then represent different ways of spending and then the consequences of each of those ways of spending. So you may have the example that I think I have linked for you on our Canvas site is an example of a bookmobile by a county library. So county library has a bookmobile. So their decision package, one course of action could be to fund the bookmobile at 100% of what it was funded at last year. We funded at 100% of last year. Here are the number of patrons that we can serve, and here's the impact upon our circulation rates. Another course of action could be funding it at 90% of what it was funded at last year. But the consequences are we're probably going to be able to serve X number of fewer patrons, and our circulation rates are going to go down by X percentage. Another course of action, we funded at 110% of what we funded at last year, so a 10% increase. Well, here's what will happen in terms of the more people we can serve and the increase in our circulation rates. Zero-based budgeting is a holistic, very rational way of thinking about our budgets where you just don't assume that we're going to continue doing next year what we did last year. It affords us the opportunity to think about things a little bit differently and to go back and re-examine why we are spending that amount of money to begin with. Now, the problem with zero-based budgeting is it creates a mountain of paperwork because you've got these dozens of decision units, each unit creating a multitude of decision packages. You're going to have this mountain of paperwork. It's going to take a lot of time, a lot of resources. And so, what most governments do if they do zero based budgeting is they'll do a modified zero based budget. And a very common approach to a modified zero based budget is what's called an 80-20 approach, whereby 80% of your budget will be budgeted in a simple incremental line item approach. And then 20% of your budget will then be subjected to zero based budget. The next year, a different 20%, and then the next year, a different 20%. So that every 5 years, every part of your budget has gone through a zero based budgeting type of process. To link this then back up to our decision-making models, line item budgeting is very incremental decision-making. Performance-based budgeting adds another level of rationality. It becomes a little bit more rational. And then program and zero-based budgeting are far more rational in the way in which we view our budgets. Line item budgets are good for control. Performance-based budgets are good for management. Program and zero-based budgets are good for the planning function. Again, we're just at this point introducing these 4 different budget formats, talking about how they work and their advantages and disadvantages to get you ready then for your public budgeting course. When you get to your public budgeting course, you'll then have the opportunity to create and analyze budgets in different types of budget formats. But up to this time in our discussion of how we manage financial resources, we have talked primarily about spending money. We have talked primarily about expenditures. But we also know that in order to spend that money, we then also have to generate money. If we do not have the money to spend, then we can't make those expenditures. So let's shift our focus briefly to the other side of the equation, the revenue generation equation. We know that governments rely upon different sources of revenue. Oftentimes they rely upon both tax-based as well as non-tax sources of revenue. So let's talk about tax-based sources of revenue first, and then we'll move to the non-tax sources. So tax-based sources of revenue. There are 3 major tax-based sources of revenue that governments rely upon: property taxes, income taxes, and sales-based taxes. Property taxes are what we consider to be a wealth-based tax, in that people pay their property taxes based upon the assessed valuation of their property. The assessed valuation of your property is a measure of your wealth, your ability to pay the tax. The problem with the property tax is when we have a disconnect between the value of your property and your income. When people pay their property taxes, they're not going to refinance or sell their property to pay their property taxes. They're likely going to pay their property taxes out of their income. So they can have a very expensive home with a high assessed valuation that they've inherited, but then the money they use to pay their property tax comes from a very small income level. That type of disconnect between ability to pay and how much people have to pay is what's known as a regressive form of taxation. So taxes can be regressive or they can be progressive in nature. A regressive tax is a tax where people who have less than an ability to pay a higher share in taxation than people with more of an ability to pay. That's what we call a regressive type of tax. By contrast, a progressive tax is a tax in which people who have more ability to pay a higher percentage than people with less than an ability to pay. So when you have a disconnect between the value of your property and your income, it can make the property tax very regressive in nature. Then there's also income taxes. Whereas property taxes are the primary domain of local governments, income taxes tend to be the primary domain of the federal government and then some state governments. 45 out of 50 states have a state income tax, and then we know the federal government gets the lion's share of its revenue from the federal income tax. Income taxes tend to be much more progressive in nature, in that they are based upon what we call a graduated marginal tax bracket system. If you do your own income taxes, you know that we have a marginal tax bracket system whereby if you say, our example, you're in the 33% tax bracket, your entire income is not taxed at 33%. It's every dollar above a certain income level then gets taxed at 33%. Every dollar below that gets taxed at 27%. Every dollar below that gets taxed at 22%, and so on and so on. That makes this a more progressive system because you are shielding people in lower income levels from paying more than their fair share in income taxes. The problem, obviously, is even though it's designed to be progressive, we have so many loopholes in our federal income tax code that those loopholes can sometimes make it feel more regressive than it really should be. We've heard all the stories about people like Warren Buffett, who actually pays a lower effective income tax rate than his secretary, who makes, by a magnitude of hundreds less than what Warren Buffett makes. That's because upper income individuals sometimes can leverage these loopholes to reduce their tax burden. But at least in theory, the income tax tends to be more progressive in nature. Property taxes and income taxes are both what we call ability to pay types of taxes. The third type of tax is a sales consumption-based tax. Sales taxes are a benefits received type of tax, in that you pay the tax based upon the benefit that you accrue by consuming some type of a commodity or some type of a service. So you purchase a candy bar, you pay the tax on the value you'll get from consuming that candy bar, indexed to the price of that candy bar. When you purchase that commodity, we don't ask you what your income level is. Everyone pays the same sales tax if they're purchasing the same commodity. So it's based upon an ability, a benefits received principle, as opposed to an ability to pay principle. As a benefits received type of tax, it means that the sales tax tends to be the more regressive of the three forms of taxation. Unless you have what we call commodity exemptions, where you can exempt some of the basic staples of life from taxation, the sales tax is going to end up being relatively regressive in nature. When you get into your 555 class, I assume you'll talk more about the specifics of how these taxes work here in the state of California. When I teach budgeting, we talk a lot about Proposition 13. We talk a lot about how that fundamentally altered the way the property tax works here in the state. One of the things, just for our purposes, is with the passage of Proposition 13 in 1978, it limited the ability of local governments to generate money from the property tax. So what then happened is that local governments had to move away from the property tax, and they had to diversify their revenue portfolios. And the way in which they did it is by moving from property taxes to more of a reliance on non-tax revenue. Non-tax revenue tends to come from sources such as user charges and user fees. A user charge is a charge that is applied to someone for the consumption of some type of a service. So you think about something like a utility charge. And so you pay a charge based upon the amount of utilities that you are consuming. That's a user charge indexed to the consumption of a service. User fees typically are not indexed to services. User fees are usually tied to things such as licenses that will provide you with the opportunity and the privilege to engage in a certain type of behavior. So you want to get a hunting license, you pay a fee. You want to get a fishing license, you pay a fee. You want to get a driver's license, you pay a fee. You want to open up a franchise in a community, you have to get a franchise license and pay a fee for that franchise license. User charges and user fees have now displaced property tax revenue as the primary source of revenue for the average typical California city. And now the average California city gets over a third of its revenue from non-tax sources like user charges and user fees. Property tax revenue for most cities has dropped down to about 15 to 20% of the revenue that they generate. The problem for some governments, obviously, is when the revenues do not equal the expenditures. So when governments are spending more money than what they are taking in terms of revenues, that's what's known as a deficit. So in any given fiscal year, if the government is spending more in expenditures than it's collecting in revenue, it is facing what's known as a deficit. The federal government has run a deficit every single year since 1969, with the exception of fiscal years 1999 and 2000. The reason why we didn't have deficits in 99 and 2000, primarily the primary reason was the growth of the economy and the dot-com boom. And all these internet companies in the Silicon Valley were bringing in so much revenue and paying so much revenue to the federal government. We had this huge spike in revenue, which then allowed us to get out of deficit spending. Then September 11th happened, beginning of the Bush administration, and the response to September 11th then increased our expenditures exponentially and then pushed us back into deficit spending. So deficits are imbalances between revenues and expenditures in a given fiscal year. Those imbalances, those deficits, if they occur every single year like they have at the federal level, the accumulation of those deficits will then contribute to the national debt. Debt is long-term in nature. There are different sources of debt. If your debt is made up of all of these annual operating deficits, that's what we consider to be bad debt, because clearly you have a structural problem. You're not generating enough money or you're spending too much money. However, if we issue debt, if we borrow money to build a new city hall that is very needed, or to make safety enhancements to our roads and to our bridges, those are necessary capital projects. The debt that we issue, the money we borrow to pay for those, that's considered to be good debt because it's necessary debt. So not all debt is bad. Governments tend to borrow money to issue different types of debt. They will borrow money and issue debt such as long-term debt, and sometimes they'll issue short-term debt. Long-term debt is money that is borrowed that matures in more than 1 year. So if you want to construct a new building, you're going to issue what's known as a bond. That bond will then be repaid over maybe a 20 or 30 or 40-year period of time. That bond is considered to be long-term debt. Short-term debt are usually referred to as being notes. So something like a tax anticipation note. So you know you're going to get tax proceeds coming in the next 6 weeks. They're not here yet. You'll borrow on a tax anticipation note and then promise to repay that money with the tax revenue when it comes in 6 weeks. So short-term debt matures in less than a year. Long-term debt matures in more than a year, typically 20, 30, or 40 years. Long-term debt are bonds, short-term debt are notes. It's the bonds that we're really concerned with because that's how we fund most of our capital projects. And there are a lot of different types of bonds that you will learn about in your 555 course. For our purposes here, we're just going to focus on 3 simple types of bonds. One type of bond you see governments using is what's called a general obligation bond, or a GO bond. General obligation bonds pledge the full faith and credit of the government to repay the debt. That means investors know that they are going to get this debt repaid. They're going to get their money back. If you do any investing, I'm sure you're very familiar with the risk versus reward balance of investing. The more risk there is for an investor, the more reward that investor is going to demand. And so if it's a very speculative, very risky type of investment, they are going to want to get a large return. General obligation bonds offer very little risk to investors because they are a full faith and credit pledge from the government, where the government is saying, we will do everything at our disposal in order to repay this debt. Whether it be laying people off, whether it be selling properties, whatever we have to do, we will do it to repay the debt. Since general obligation bonds offer very little risk to investors, investors have very few expectations for reward. And so the interest rates that you have to pay as a government for issuing general obligation bonds tends to be relatively low. It's a relatively cheap way of borrowing money. However, depending upon the general obligation bond you're issuing, these general obligation bonds oftentimes require voter approval. And sometimes they will require a supermajority 2/3 voter approval. So you kind of have to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of a general obligation bond, but they tend to be the cheapest form of bond that you can issue. Then there's another type of bond known as a revenue bond. So say, for instance, you are going to construct a recreation center. So you're going to borrow money to build that recreation center. When you operate this recreation center, you are going to charge fees to people for using the center. So the center will generate revenue. If the center will generate enough revenue to cover not only the operating expenditures, but also the repayment on the debt that was issued to build the recreation center, you can use a revenue bond. Revenue bonds, the repayment is based upon the revenue generated by the enterprise, the facility that is being built. Revenue bonds are more risky investments because you don't have the full faith and credit protection as an investor. If this recreation center goes belly up and doesn't generate any revenue, you're not going to get your money back. So there are much higher interest rates that are associated with revenue bonds. They're much more costly to governments, but governments oftentimes do not have to get voter approval for those revenue bonds. A nice balance between the two is what's called a double barrel bond. Part of the debt will be general obligation, part of the debt will be revenue. This is a good option to use if the facility is generating revenue, but is not generating enough revenue to cover operating expenditures as well as entire repayment of the debt. In that type of situation, you might want to use a double barrel bond, and that double barrel bond will then have an interest rate that is less than a revenue bond, but will be higher than a general obligation bond. So just like everything else in public administration, there's no best answer in terms of the best type of bond out there. It's more which bond is most appropriate for the type of project that you are trying to fund. So what we are facing today, especially at the national level, is we are facing a budget process that there's no other way to look at than a budget process that's somewhat out of control. We cannot get our budgets done on time at the federal level. We don't follow regular order in terms of passing 12 appropriation bills. We use these OBRAs and continuing resolutions. So we're having trouble getting our budgets done on time. And we've also had, as we've said before, trouble getting our budgets in on budget, in that we're oftentimes running a deficit at the federal level. For the past almost 40 or well, 30, over 40, do your math really quick, over 50 years, every single year with the exception of 2, we have run a deficit. So when you're not getting your budget done on time and your expenditures are exceeding your revenues, you have a problem in your budgeting process. And that's what we are facing and have been facing at the federal level. To try and fix that problem, Congress continually goes back to try and reform the federal budgeting process. In the 1970s and 1974, we had a huge piece of legislation called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. The Budget and Impoundment Control Act was meant to try and revise the process to make the process work better so we can get budgets done on time. It created the House and Senate budget committees that we talked about. It created the idea of a budget resolution that we talked about earlier as well, made all these changes to the process. But unfortunately, as we know, post 1974, we still were not getting our budgets done on time. So focusing on the process didn't work. Then in the 1980s, we had a series of 2 acts known as Graham-Rudman-Hollings 1 and 2. And that's the people on the screen are Graham, Rudman, and Hollings, the 3 co-sponsors of both of those pieces of legislation. Graham, Rudman, and Hollings 1 and 2, instead of focusing on the process, focused on deficits. And what we did in the 1980s is we said, well, if we can establish the maximum allowable deficit targets and say Congress cannot have a deficit above these targets, then we can create a timetable where every year the deficit target goes down and down and down until after 20 years, the deficit target is 0 and we no longer have a deficit. Makes sense in the classroom, makes sense on paper. The problem was that Congress, whenever it realized that it was going to exceed a deficit target, it simply increased that deficit target, and then it reset the timetable. So every year we were coming in above our targets, we would just manipulate the targets, revise them upward, and then start over again. Congress simply did not have the willpower in order to eliminate deficits. And the way in which Graham-Rudman Hollings 1 and 2 would work is that if any given year, if the deficit came in above the deficit target, then the president was responsible for making across the board cuts to get the deficit down to that deficit target. Those across the board cuts were known as sequestration. And I put that in text chat. It's kind of your 25-cent word of the night, sequestration. The president would then sequester funds that would then prohibit funds from being spent across the board, across all non-exempt categories until we got the deficit down to the deficit target. Again, it didn't work. Number one, it was unconstitutional. But number two, it didn't work because Congress just kept increasing the deficit target. So in the 1970s, we learned looking at the process alone doesn't fix the problem. In the 1980s, we learned looking at deficits alone will not fix the problem. So in 1990, we tried it again with the Budget Enforcement Act. In the Budget Enforcement Act, rather than looking at process or looking at deficit, we looked at spending. We said we could eliminate deficits by reducing spending. So in the Budget Enforcement Act, what we did is we created 3 different categories of spending: defense spending, domestic spending, and international spending. And we then put what we call firewalls between those categories. So if you wanted to spend more money on a new domestic program, you would have to pay for it by decreasing spending on another domestic program. You cannot rob from international spending to pay for more domestic spending. We also introduced this idea known as pay-go, and that's something we still see come back up now and then in Congress today. Pay-go stands for pay as you go. So again, you want to spend more money on a program, you want to start a new program, you got to pay for it by decreasing spending or eliminating another program. You can't pay for it by borrowing more money. This fiscal discipline that was imposed on spending in the Budget Enforcement Act was then augmented in the Balanced Budget Acts of 1993 and 1997. And then that focus on spending combined with the quickly growing economy and this exponential increase in the amount of revenue coming into the federal government allowed us to finally get rid of deficits in 1999 and 2000. And it's really relatively simple math. When you're collecting more revenue and you're spending less money, you're going to be able to eliminate deficits. As we said, then September 11th came along in 2001 and then plunged us back into deficit spending. And we have been in deficit spending ever since for the past 22 years. But the moral of the story here is if the federal government really wants to get control of the budgeting process, getting control of the budgeting process is much more a matter of political willpower than it is procedural changes. And we're kind of learning that this year. And with the vacating of the speakership, yes, Republicans wanted to go to regular order. Yes, they wanted to get 12 appropriation bills passed, but they didn't, or they and Democrats did not have the political willpower to do that. If you don't have the political willpower to get the budget done on time and to eliminate deficits, those things are never going to happen. Where we are going from here, we'll wrap this up quickly, in terms of the future of budgeting and finance in the public sector. We're starting to feel some of the impact, continuing to feel the impact from the COVID pandemic. A lot of local governments and state governments were relatively held harmless in the wake of the COVID pandemic because a lot of these COVID grants that were coming from the national government. Now, over the past 6 to 8 months, we have seen the phasing out of a lot of those grants. And as those COVID grants have gone away, state and local governments are really starting to feel the true impact of the COVID pandemic. That's one of the reasons why in our May revise this year, we had some cuts to the governor's budget from January because we had less revenue coming in and we had less federal grant money coming in now that we are somewhat on the other side, hopefully, of the COVID pandemic. Again, this just kind of introduces you to the idea of budgeting and finance and the idea of the management of fiscal resources as one of the major jobs that we have, one of the major functions that we have in public administration as public administrators. And that is it. That covers all the information that we typically cover here in the PPA 500 class, and we've done it with 3 minutes to spare. You now have all the information that you need in order to do a good job on your final assessment, to do all 5 of those scenarios. Again, we will not have class next Tuesday. We'll just reserve that for you to have time to work on your final assessment. Final assessment due by midnight next Tuesday, and then Canvas essay number 5 and your 2 responses due next Sunday. And then once you turn in the final assessment, you are then done with this class, and I will work on grading those assessments and trying to get your final grades uploaded as soon as I possibly can. I will alert you to one thing is that the NASPA annual meeting, that's our national accrediting body for our program, is next week. And so I'm flying to beautiful scenic Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for that conference next Tuesday. So my grading may be a little bit delayed. I'm going to try and get the final assessments graded as quickly as I can, but I'll be doing it from the road. My goal is to try and have everything graded, the final grades uploaded no later than Friday, and that is if everything goes well, but don't hold me to it. Okay, that's all we have. Any questions or anything before we finish up for the evening? Again, I apologize for talking so much over the past 7 weeks, but it is a whole lot of information that we try and fit into a hybrid approach like this. And so it does require me to talk a little bit more than I usually would in most of my courses. A lot of your future courses are going to be much less lecture oriented. This is the introductory course, so it tends to be very lecture heavy. A lot of your future courses will be much more discussion, graduate seminar types of approaches. And so this course is a little bit atypical compared to a lot of the other courses that you will be taking. If you have any questions as you're working on the final assessment, feel free to reach out, shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Also, next Tuesday, when you turn in your final assessment, please, you can also do the course evaluation. Get that turned in. You should have gotten an email or will be getting an email from SPOT very soon. SPOT is the Student Perception of Teaching. That's the course evaluation system to do that. Okay. All right. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, it was a pleasure working with you. And thanks for everything. And hope you have a great week. And I look forward to reading your final assessments. So take care, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Powell.
Thank you, Dr. Powell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.